Hi. In my last video, I went through the beginning of Europe's exploitation of the source of spices. We saw Portugal make their way to India, and then later Indonesia, and now they own a bunch of those islands thanks to a few individual sailors. And those islands that they now own are making them a disgusting amount of money. However, that pesky Pope drew a line, and now everybody's kind of confused on who owns what. Did Portugal really own those incredibly lucrative islands? Or did their mortal enemy Spain have foothold in them? I ended the last video discussing how the Portuguese sailor Ferdinand Magellan had made his way to Spain after Portugal had rejected one of his voyages, changing his name to Ferdinand Magellan, with some music in the background that was a little too loud. And I left it on a cliffhanger. In this video, we'll take a look at Spain's introduction into this conflict after being on the outside looking in, and the insane history that comes along with it. Let's get into it. Magellan was an ambitious man. He was confident that his ideas would lead himself and Spain to glory, but Spain was understandably suspicious of his character. Magellan had made his way from their bitter rival Portugal to their capital and proposed his idea to sail west and attempt to find a way around the Americas and find the Moluccas Islands. From the beginning, Magellan's authority over his own voyage was being incredibly undermined, mostly by Spanish officials who didn't trust him. He was made co-captain of his own fleet, a fleet which was being heavily invested in by the Spanish Crown of Castile, who invested about 80% of the fleet's funding. The Casa de Contratación would be the institution to oversee his venture. They handled a lot of financial stuff in Spain's New World territories, and since the Crown had sunk so much money into his trip, they took serious precautions. A man named Juan de Fonseca would spend a lot of time attempting to undermine the power that Magellan had been handed in this voyage. He appointed Juan de Cartagena as Inspector General of Magellan's fleet, basically an accountant. This position would keep the captain's power in check. Cartagena had also received orders from the Crown to basically inform them of how Magellan was respecting their instructions, as well as interactions with natives on lands that they found. The thing is, Magellan didn't know that Cartagena was sent to do this. His mere presence basically told him that the Spanish crown didn't trust those pesky Portuguese guys that he had sent so much money to. Something funny pointed out by Roger Crowley, author of Spice, the recommended book for this video, is that Cartagena essentially got his position because he was nephew of Juan de Fonseca. I use air quotes here because back in the day, nephew was just kind of a weird way of saying somebody was your illegitimate son. So that's funny. As if the Spanish couldn't get more paranoid about Magellan's voyage, they appointed almost every single position as a Spaniard, and orders were given by the Crown to limit the amount of Portuguese on the voyage to 12 out of 235 men. Basically, all the captains, except for Magellan and his co-captain, were Spanish, but a lot of the navigators were Portuguese. But it was kind of hard to keep that number down to just 12 Portuguese men. It was hard to find experienced sailors in Castile, so the number ended up being around 37. An Italian man named Antonio de Pigafetta joined and became Magellan's hagiographer. I think that's how you say that. Basically, he would write accounts of the voyage, and he did a damn good job. Things appeared to be going pretty well for Magellan, but somebody was angry. Big Daddy Portugal had found out what he was doing, and they were not happy. Magellan's voyage presented a very real possibility of hurting their own foreign interests in the Spice Islands, which made them brand Magellan and his co-captain as traitors. They tried to lure him back, saying that Magellan would be treated well and that his voyage would be considered, but understandably Magellan saw execution as a more possible outcome. Because of this, the Spanish provided Magellan and his co-captain with bodyguards. Still, even in Spain there was a big movement of anti-Portuguese sentiment, especially in the Casa de Contratación. I'm so sorry if I'm not saying that well, it's hard for my English voice to say. These events bothered Magellan very, very personally, and he was even found by the Portuguese agents of Seville crying to himself, where he confessed that he was under extreme stress. The Portuguese agent of Seville, Sebastião Alvarez, was kind of an asshole. He reported back to the Portuguese king as much as possible with information surrounding Magellan's voyage. In one letter, he informed the king of the planned route the fleet would take, and added to it saying, May God the Almighty grant that they make a voyage like that of the Corte Reals, and your highness may remain at rest. The Corte Reals, for those who don't know, was a Portuguese voyage who sailed into the northern seas and was never seen again. Not cool, man. Things would only get harder for Magellan as his co-captain Falero had begun to appear quite mentally unstable and was replaced with Cartagena himself, which only further tightened the political grip that Fonseca and other Spanish officials had over Magellan's voyage. This only added to the chaos of the fleet's preparations, as there began to be much debate over who was really in charge. Eventually, Cartagena and Magellan finally received final orders from the King Charles. It essentially set the precedent that Magellan would have to share all information with every single captain on his fleet, and a clear plan for the voyage must be set in writing. The other order was to absolutely not go near Portuguese territory, especially in their Treaty of Tordesillas territory. That order was kind of dumb, because in order to go on the voyage that Magellan had planned, you had to go along the Portuguese-owned eastern coast of Brazil. But as for the Spice Islands, the question of the Tordesillas line had yet to be answered. Charles wanted no funny business, saying his orders were to, quote, proceed straight to the spicery. In early August of 1519, only 2 months before Cortes would meet the most powerful empire in the Americas, Magellan's fleet was loaded with 2 years' worth of supplies and was ready to go. King Charles, now actually Holy Roman Emperor Charles, desired to be a world monarch with his new, vast holdings not only in Europe but also the Americas. The man who would be his agent of destiny was Magellan. Hi, I hope you're doing well. Just came here to interrupt myself to tell you about my Patreon. So my lifelong goal is to become a collegiate level history professor, but at most schools, the cost of a teaching credential can be anywhere between $15,000 and $20,000. Now, I've been trying to save up for this as much as I can while I'm still in the early stages of my education, but if you'd like to help contribute, you can go ahead and donate to my Patreon. It'll go towards me saving up for the teaching credential, but also just kind of help me keep the lights on, you know? If you don't feel like it, totally fine. I'll only cry a little. And thank you to my current patrons, Drewski and Amber. If you'd like to be shown here, just go check it out. So maybe you could be my agent of destiny, and check it out in the link in description. Thank you. Back to it. Plus ultra means further, by the way, and was Emperor Charles's favorite motto. On the 10th of August, 1519, Magellan's fleet set sail, stopped for another month to finish provisioning, and finally left Iberia. After a stop in the Canary Islands, the plan had them sailing southwest towards Brazil. But Magellan had different plans. In a move that's still not clearly understood, the fleet instead sailed south, parallel to Africa. Magellan took this opportunity to state his authority, taking advantage of the unclear ladder of command on his fleet. It's entirely possible that he did this maneuver because of rumors that the Portuguese had sent a fleet to intercept him on their way to Brazil, or it was just to test his men's loyalty. This alternate route would cause them trouble. Pigafetta wrote, saying, "Many days did we sail along the coast of Guinea, with contrary winds, calms, and rain without wind, until we reached the equinoctial line, having 60 days of continual rain. Before we reached the line, many furious squalls of wind and currents of water struck us head on. In order that the ships might not be wrecked, all the sails were struck, and in this manner did we wander hither and yon on the sea, waiting for the tempest to cease. When it rained, there was no wind. When the sun shone, it was calm." Pigafetta even witnessed the phenomenon of St. Elmo's fire, where the presence of a tall object like a mast builds up a bunch of electrical charge, which causes the tip to glow bright blue. To the God-fearing sailors on Pigafetta's ship, it made them fall to their knees and cry. I don't know. I thought that was interesting. From here on, Magellan was no longer going to act under Charles's orders. This was his fleet, and he was going to make sure everybody knew it. After the leader of one ship, the Victoria, was caught in an act of sodomy with a cabin boy, a crime usually punishable by death, a court-martial was called. Cartagena and Magellan would have to meet face-to-face for the first time since the fleet had embarked. This was Magellan's chance to assert the authority he knew he held. The Spanish crown had done nothing but attempt to undermine him, but they weren't in Spain anymore. The sea was a place of autonomy, any man's game. When the Spanish and Portuguese met up on the flagship Trinidad, Cartagena approached Magellan and once again brought up the question of leadership and the route. This was a mistake. Magellan grabbed Cartagena by the throat and threw him in the hole, ordering that he be restrained. He was the captain, and everybody knew it now. Pigafetta recorded none of this, and Roger Crowley states that while all this was happening, Pigafetta was apparently on the side of his ship watching birds and fishing for sharks. He was often very favorable towards Magellan, but it's not known if he left this out on purpose. It is entirely possible that Magellan sent his fleet in a complete opposite direction to give himself time to assert his authority. Taking the original route would have had them arriving on the Brazilian coast in about 6 weeks, but this new alternate route had them arriving there in 3 months. Another effect was creating dissent among the crew. After provisioning near Rio de Janeiro, they continued, landed in a more southern region, met some women, traded with the native Tupi people, and killed that commander who committed sodomy by strangulating him. Good riddance. This area in Brazil was apparently so awesome that a lot of men attempted to desert and live among the natives there, but they ended up being brought back. They had to continue onward, and as they traveled along the South American coast, it began to taper west, and they began to search any river, bay, whatever might be a strait through the continent. They had no luck. Their travel southward only saw the weather and currents worsen. They witnessed giants, or the Patagonians, who they thought were giants because some of them were taller than average, I guess, and they captured 2 of them to bring back to Spain. The ships began taking serious damage. The Victoria struck a shoal and was almost wrecked, while all but 1 cable on the Trinidad broke. The weather would subside and then come right back, and they saw more St. Elmo's fire, which gave the sailors hope that God was watching. Morale was pretty low as the ships beached at the port of St. Julian, but Magellan held strong, even though the Spanish were apparently being very bitchy. But then they mutinied. In the night, they put Magellan in chains and stabbed the captain of one of the ships, the Concepcion, several times. He would live for 3 more months, which sounds like hell. My God. The mutiny took over the Concepcion and the San Antonio, while Magellan and his supporters held the Trinidad and Santiago. Magellan sent men in, attacking the rebellion head-on, and within 24 hours, it was quelled. The bodies of leaders of the coup were strung upside down on poles on the ships. In total, over 40 men were tried and executed for the rebellion, and Magellan personally inspected every single member of the crew to make sure there was no dissent left. Even the poor cabin boy, which had been sodomized, was thrown overboard. This was certainly going to hurt the fleet's ability to continue. The fleet would need to spend the winter in St. Julian's Bay. Magellan sent the Santiago south to continue their search for a strait of any kind, which ended up wrecking, and the poor crew had to walk for 70 miles back to the rest of the fleet through blizzards, reportedly not eating for 35 days. Oh my God. After a rough winter, in April, the ship set out yet again. Many men began to think Magellan had been exceeding his authority, and he decided to go easy on the imprisoned Cartagena by marooning him on an island with some food and a sword. From here on, nobody dared question Magellan's authority. With morale low and supplies dwindling, the crew would finally make a promising discovery. They came across a large bay with incredibly deep water. They named it, I'm not kidding, the Cape of 11,000 Virgins. Like, I get it was because it was St. Ursula's Day, but you couldn't just name it the Cape of St. Ursula or something? Why 11,000? Why not 5? Or none? They sent 2 ships into the bay to see what they could find, and after 3 days of anxious waiting, they returned, guns blazing. They had found a second bay, which connected to a slew of estuaries and canals. For days, the fleet would attempt to find their way through this maze, even losing the San Antonio on the way after one of its crewmen mutinied and took the ship back to Portugal, stealing one of the Patagonian giants. But finally, on the 1st of November, the Trinidad and the Victoria took a sharp right turn around what they called Cape Froward and entered a small channel. Suddenly, the tides and wind was different and the salinity of the water had changed. Magellan asked around for opinions to see if what he was seeing was true. Some said yes, some said no. Many said nothing because they were deathly afraid of him now. Some called it a great gulf and suggested turning back. Many still didn't believe that they had found it, and especially after the loss of the San Antonio, which carried a lot of their supplies, Magellan remained very anxious. They anchored in what they named the River of Sardines, where they gathered much needed supplies. Most importantly, they snacked on wild celery, which provided them with a good chunk of vitamin C. While waiting, they sent out a boat to investigate this supposed Great Gulf, but after 3 days the men returned. The captain of the boat reportedly wept upon realizing that they had found what he called Cape Deseado, the desired cape. They had done it. They had found their strait. Their mission was complete. The entire reason they went on this voyage was to find a strait around the Americas or through it, instead of having to go east through Portuguese territory, and Magellan had done it. That, to all of you, my determination to go on is a serious matter, but the window of opportunity for making this voyage is short, Magellan would say to his officers. They had a choice to make. Either continue on and brace the dangers of going into the open sea blindly, or turn back and come back with a much more well-equipped fleet. Magellan said this quote as more of a cover-up. If they decided to turn back and the Emperor didn't like that, he could simply say it was the officer's idea. But oddly, this time he kind of changed his tune. Instead of stamping down opposition on his fleet with threats and violence, he decided to go with the age-old tradition of lying. Well, not really lying. When asking their opinions on whether they should turn back or not, Magellan reminded his officers of St. Julian and what happened to those who mutinied against him, namely Cartagena. This tactic worked, as the chief navigator responded with a large letter that finished with saying, "Your lordship shall do as seems best, and God leads him." The very next day, all 3 remaining ships exited what they called the Strait of Patagonia, now called the Strait of Magellan, and made their way to the Pacific Ocean. Magellan wept as they became engulfed by the sea. It was only a matter of time before they reached the Spice Islands, Magellan believed. He had yet to understand just how giant this task had really become. It wasn't known to the naive sailors on these ships, but their journey to the Moluccas would encompass over 9,500 miles. We traveled about 4,000 leagues during those 3 months, in 20 days through an open stretch in the Pacific Sea. In truth, it was very peaceful, for during that time we did not suffer any storm. We were 3 months and 20 days without getting any kind of fresh food. We ate biscuit, which was no longer biscuit, but powder of biscuit swarming with worms, for they had eaten the good. It stank strongly of the urine of rats. We drank yellow water that had been putrid for days. This was Pigafetta's account of their journey across the Pacific. Sounds bad? Yeah, but listen to this. We also ate some ox hides that covered the top of the main yard to prevent the yard from chafing the shrouds, and which had become exceedingly hard because of the sun, rain, and wind. We left them in the sea for 4 or 5 days, and then placed them for a few moments on top of the embers, and so ate them. And often we ate sawdust from boards. Rats were sold for 1 ducat apiece, and even then we could not get them. But above all the other misfortunes, the following was the worst. The gums of both the lower and upper teeth of some of our men swelled, so that they could not eat under any circumstances and therefore died. 19 men died from that sickness, and the giant together with an Indian from the country of Verzin. 25 or 30 men fell sick in the arms, legs, or in another place, so that but few remained well. However, I, by the grace of God, suffered no sickness. A sailor's worst nightmare had finally caught up with them. Scurvy. But luckily for Pigafetta and Magellan, they had stored some jelly for themselves, which apparently prevented them from getting scurvy. As they continued on, all that they would encounter was small sandy atolls, which provided them nothing. Soon after, they would reach the equator. Magellan knew that the Moluccas lie due west, right on the equator, but he decided to continue northwest. Continuing on this path would have led him to the islands of the west, of Las Filipinas, the Philippines. In desperate need of provisions, they finally spotted some land. As they sailed up and anchored outside an island, some of the native people came up to them in a boat and proceeded to rob their ships. The men were just too weak to fight back. Magellan, being understandably pretty pissed about this, sent out some men the next day who looted, burned, and pillaged. They gathered provisions like fresh fruits and made their way back to their ships, followed behind by very fast outrigger boats. They were actually the first Europeans to ever witness this traditional Polynesian style of boat. They managed to escape in time. Magellan called the island Las Islas de los Ladrones, the Islands of Thieves. Today, we know the island as Guam. On March 16th, they witnessed islands in the Philippines and landed on islands where the people clearly had much different temperaments. The sailors were shown some much needed hospitality, and Magellan, being European, decided to flex their muscles a little bit and fire off some cannons. They would venture further into the Philippine archipelago. Pigafetta almost died after falling off one of the boats, but he was saved, and they landed on an island called Limasawa with a well-established kingdom, and became very friendly with the locals. Magellan even became friends with the king, Roger Crowley, and they even let them celebrate Easter Sunday. They paraded a big cross across the island and eventually put it on top of a big hill, which was kind of the European way of saying that they owned something. Magellan had been scheming. They didn't really know this, but the Portuguese reputation had been kind of spread all throughout Southeast Asia after they had taken Malacca. Colombo suggested another island for Magellan to visit and accompanied the fleet to the location. When they arrived on the island of Cebu, they were greeted warmly by the island's king, Humaban. However, a trader from the island of Siam, who had experience with the Portuguese, pulled the king aside and warned him that these white men were dangerous, saying, quote, "If they are treated well, they will give good treatment, but if they are treated evil and worse treatment, as they have done to Calicut and Malacca." It appears the king didn't heed this warning, and he even invited the Europeans to a feast. The locals and the sailors took part in gift-giving, feasting, something called a blood brother ritual. I swear people did that in like elementary school. And some traditional Spanish mock combat. Remember when I said that Magellan was scheming? Well, here's where that starts to kind of become evident. Roger Crowley says, quote, "The aim was both to impress and intimidate. There were warnings and enticements that, quote, our arms were soft towards our friends and harsh towards our enemies. And as handkerchiefs wipe off the sweat, so did our arms overthrow and destroy all our adversaries." Magellan was upping the stakes, claiming the country for Spain, seeking controllable allies. While King Humaban was paying tribute to the Spanish king, Pigafetta was, of course, on his own, being adorable, and recording some actions of the native people, including their startling sexual practices. He's definitely my favorite character in this video. However, while things appeared to actually be going very well for the sailors, Magellan had begun to act differently. He had captained an incredible voyage to this point, survived horrendous circumstances by luck and perseverance, and it kind of started getting to his head. He began preaching his Christian faith, even setting a date to baptize King Humaban, in which there was an elaborate ceremony where hundreds of natives were baptized, which even spread to other nearby islands. King Humaban was even given a Christian name, Charles. Magellan began coming down hard on those who refused to be converted, even burning villages. He was riding high on a wave of egocentrism. But why this sudden shift? Well, the answer may lie in a clause in his contract with Holy Roman Emperor Charles. When creating his contract for his voyage, Magellan requested to add an interesting clause. It stated, paraphrasing by the way, that if Magellan managed to find the Spice Islands or anything else, he was entitled to the ownership of up to 6 islands. Whether Charles just didn't care or maybe just didn't have faith that he would even find anything, he let it slide. Back to the Philippines, Magellan converting all of these natives and iron-fisting other islands may have been his own personal operation to fulfill this clause. Through his experiences from Spain to St. Julian to the Philippines, Magellan had seemingly lost his mind, turning to tyranny. He felt invincible, but unfortunately for Magellan, it was only a feeling. While Magellan was working to create his own personal kingdom in the Philippines, he was beginning to take advantage of his actual position. Many nearby islands, some converted, some not, began paying tribute to the king of Cebu, now known as Charles. One island, known as Mactan, was split between 2 kings. On April 26th, one king, Sula, was willing to pay tribute, but the other king, Lapu-Lapu, refused. He simply could not find a reason to submit to Humaban. King Sula, likely terrified of the consequences of one half of his island refusing to pay, asked King Humaban to send men to his island to sort out Lapu-Lapu. Magellan felt up to the task and decided to crush the resistance himself. He began planning an attack, and King Humaban offered men, but Magellan refused, telling him to stay back to watch and learn, saying, quote, "to see how the lions of Spain fought." However, for the first time since the marooning of Cartagena, Magellan's authority began to be spoken against. Magellan's men, including Pigafetta, begged him not to go, but Magellan refused. He believed that his steel armor and gunpowder was enough to quell this rebellion even without the help of King Humaban's men. Pigafetta recounts what happened that night. At midnight, 60 of us set out, armed with corselets and helmets. They ended up being accompanied by Humaban and his men, but they would stay back. Only 5 miles away, they reached the harbor of Mactan just before dawn. Magellan sent out a direct message to Lapu-Lapu asking him to submit and pay tribute under the threat of seeing how their lances wounded. Lapu-Lapu replied saying that if Magellan had lances, they had lances of bamboo and stakes hardened with fire. Lapu-Lapu asked Magellan to wait until dawn to attack so that he could get more men, and Magellan for some reason was like, alright. As the Victoria, Concepcion, and Trinidad, along with Humaban's men, stayed back, the dawn broke. In total, 49 men in steel armor jumped into the thigh-deep water and began wading towards the shore for half a mile. The boats were too far back to provide any support. Only 49 men, exhausted simply from walking to the shore in their heavy armor, stood against the army of Lapu-Lapu, over 1,500 men. Forcing his strongest allies to stand back as spectators, it was pretty clear that Magellan had made a mistake. Lapu-Lapu's army charged forward, jumping back and forth, blocking crossbow shots with their wooden shields, wielding bamboo spears, while others stayed back and fired arrows at some of the Europeans. Some threw mud and stones. The men began to panic. Magellan ordered 2 men to burn a nearby building as a distraction, but that did nothing but anger the army even more, as they killed those 2 soldiers. Men began to desert back into the sea, and Magellan was hit in the leg by an arrow. Like Achilles, he was hit in the one spot that wasn't covered by the armor he had so much confidence in. Magellan and his tight-knit band of soldiers, who stayed by his side, all began to back into the water. The water was up to their knees as the men began to throw sharp bamboo spears at them. Lapu-Lapu's men found and targeted Magellan, knocking off his helmet twice. For an hour, the men held out, but it was evident that the end was near. Pigafetta, loyal as a dog, who stayed with his captain until the end, recounted Magellan's death as such. An Indian hurled the bamboo spear into the captain's face, but the latter immediately killed him with a lance. Then, trying to lay a hand on sword, he could draw it out only halfway, because he had been wounded in the arm by a bamboo spear. When the natives saw that, they all hurled themselves upon him. One of them wounded him on the leg with a large cutlass. That caused the captain to fall face downward, when immediately they rushed upon him with iron and bamboo spears, and with their cutlasses, until they killed our mirror, our light, our comfort, and our true guide. Lapu-Lapu refused to give back Magellan's body, keeping it as a memorial. Humaban wept as he heard of Magellan's death, but he came to a bit of a realization. The Spanish were not invincible. On May 1st, he invited some of Magellan's former men to a feast, and to receive jewels which he had promised to the captain. 30 went to shore, about a quarter of the entire crew, including the newly appointed captains Duarte Barbosa, Magellan's brother-in-law, and Juan Serrano. Pigafetta stayed on the ship, as he had been wounded at Macata, until suddenly he saw 2 men rowing their boats back to the ship. He recounts saying, "They told us they saw the man, who had been cured by a miracle performed by Magellan, take the priest to his house. Consequently, they had left that place because they suspected some evil. Scarcely had they spoken those words when we heard loud cries and lamentations. Those screams that they heard were a massacre. They could do nothing but listen to their fellow crewmates being killed one after the other as they fired shots into houses near the shore. Suddenly, one man appeared on the beach with his hands tied. It was Juan Serrano, screaming for rescue, yelling to them that all except an interpreter were dead. The fleet was forced to sail away, as Serrano's dying shrieks pierced their ears, and the cross erected on a nearby peak was torn down. Humaban's treaty with the intruders was dead. Magellan's hunger for personal glory had led to the death of over a quarter of his crew. He convinced himself he had power over a complex political environment in a part of the world never before seen by his people, and he ultimately paid the price for his ignorance. On May 2nd, 1521, the ships ventured off yet again. Everything of worth was transferred to the Victoria and Trinidad, and the Concepcion was abandoned. The crew had been whittled down to 110 men, far too few to man 3 ships. They began sailing south towards their original goal, the Moluccas. They wandered lost for over a month, even stealing some natives to pilot the ships towards their goal. Eventually, on November 6th, 1521, it happened. A line of giant volcanoes filled the horizon as the smell of cloves pierced their noses. It was clear. They had found the spice. Jesus, a lot just happened, huh? I think we should take a small step back really quick. This video is titled Europe's Race to Spice, Spain, but I should really at this point be replacing Spain with Magellan. This has really been his story up to his death. He was just such an interesting personality who kind of embodied the spirit of Spanish colonizers. Rebellious, ambitious, violent, short-tempered. It made sense to follow the man who had led Spain to this point. But from here on, I think we should take a step back and analyze the bigger picture. This video is about Spain after all. Hi. So, as I mentioned before in the beginning of this video and also my previous video on Portugal, Spain has been trying to find their own way to the source of spice while staying out of Portuguese Tordesillas territory, which was preventing them from going around Africa. Looking at this through a 21st century lens is kind of funny. Just how dedicated that they were to not crossing this imaginary line. Like, the oceans are giant, and I kind of suspect that they wouldn't be noticed if they just went into Portuguese territory. Whatever. But really quick, just to get kind of a grip on what's going on here politically, we have to go back and check on our buddy Portugal. So by 1514, while Europe was arguing with itself on who really owned what, Portugal was making their way east and fast. Portuguese King Manuel I believed that he had a God-given mission to discover and explore and made sure that all of his sailors were counted as much information as possible. Portugal from the start actually had a pretty vested interest in contacting China and establishing trade relations. They would ask natives that they met about if they knew anything about how to get to China, how big their nation was, etc. Luckily for them, Chinese merchant ships were pretty common in Malacca, and Manuel I made sure that all of his men documented as much information as they could. Portugal's intention wasn't to get a worldly education, it was more to study a potential opponent. Roger Crowley says, not only did he, Manuel I, want to know, quote, if they are wealthy merchants, but also, quote, if they are weak men or warriors, and if they have arms of artillery and what clothes they wear, and if they are men great in body. Trade and conquest went hand in hand. This confusion of mentalities would cause the Portuguese great difficulties. The Portuguese also appeared to have a bit of a lack of an understanding about just how giant and powerful that China was at the time. The Portuguese king always had the question of potential conquest on his mind. One apothecary who the king liked to take advice from was Tomé Pires. Pires had experience traveling in Southeast Asia, and his descriptions of local nations were invaluable to the king. On the question of potential Chinese conquest, he said, quote, China is an important, good, and very wealthy country, and the governor of Malacca would not need as much force as they say to bring it under our rule. With 10 ships, the governor of India, Alfonso de Albuquerque, who took Malacca, could take the whole of China along the seacoast, and China is 20 days sailing for our ships. A pretty insane assumption for a few reasons. For one, a meeting between Portuguese and Chinese royalty would be a serious clash of ideologies. They were on literal complete opposite sides of Eurasia, so they were in completely opposite economic climates. Why? Well, for two, Portugal had been getting disgustingly rich off their exploitation of the source of spices, while since being under Mongol rule and recently breaking out of it, the Chinese have completely closed themselves off from foreign trade. Except for a few places, which all pledged their submissive nature to Big Daddy China. One of those bottoms was Malacca, but the Portuguese conquering the city would really cause issues in the future for trade relations between Portugal and China. For three, the Ming dynasty was the most powerful empire in Asia at the time. The most powerful in the world was the Aztec Empire. You go, girl. By 1517, Portugal was ready to move in on China and sent a fleet commanded by Ferdinand Perez de Andrade, along with Tomé Pires as a commercial agent. Arriving at the mouth of the Pearl River, they experienced Chinese hospitality firsthand, and eventually made it all the way up the river to the city of Canton, where an envoy was planned to be sent to the emperor, which included Pires. The Chinese system of bureaucracy was slow. The emperor really took his time with things. Thankfully, Andrade was patient and waited for 3 months. But then some cholera came and wrecked their crew, killing 9 men, and the fleet left the city. The Portuguese were actually kind of catching some lucky breaks. Unlike his predecessors, the Chinese emperor at the time, Zhongdi, was actually pretty tolerant and was very open to foreign relations. The Portuguese established good relations with China, and Andrade came home to Malacca a hero. Despite their efforts, these good relations would soon be tarnished by none other than Andrade's brother, Simão de Andrade, who all just called Simão to avoid confusion. Unlike his brother, he was impatient and notoriously short-tempered, and brought aggression the Portuguese hadn't shown since their conquests in Africa and India. When he arrived in Canton, Simão expected Pires to have already been back from his envoy to see the emperor, only to find that he hadn't even left yet. The Chinese systems needed to run their course, especially taking caution with these foreign people. All through 1519, Pires waited, while Simão was just going completely manic. He constructed a fort on the Pearl River on an island, which was seen as incredibly disrespectful. To go even further, he set up gallows on that fort and hung one of his own men, which was also seen as disrespectful. Only Chinese could kill in their territory. Simão even assaulted a trade relations officer and attempted to block other Asian traders from trading their goods before the Portuguese could trade theirs. That was like the record for the amount of times the word trade has been said in one sentence. He was attempting to monopolize the business. Some accounts even say that the Portuguese had started stealing and eating children, which probably isn't true, but it just kind of gives you a sense of how the Chinese were feeling about them at this point. All the goodwill that Simão's brother had projected was gone now, and the Europeans were seen as killers and enemies. But Simão's actions wouldn't go unpunished. Pires's patience was finally answered in January of 1520, and he began the super long walk to meet the emperor in Nanjing. However, on their way there, word of Simão's actions actually reached the emperor, who rerouted the trip to meet in Beijing. He would travel another 1,200 miles before finally meeting Zhongdi in Beijing in February of 1521. The emperor was given 2 letters, one from King Manuel I and another from Ferdinand de Andrade. The Chinese generally dealt in a tributary system and perhaps expected the Portuguese to do the same, but when Zhongdi read the letter from Manuel, he was not pleased. It did not meet his ideologies, and thus he ordered the foreigners out of his country. These Europeans had been wreaking havoc in his port city and now come to him with a letter with offensive implications. He had also been tipped off by the deposed former Sultan of Malacca that information gathering was a strategy used for conquest by Portugal. This meeting solidified that fact for him. It was unacceptable. As Pires made his way back to Canton, Zhongdi died, possibly by falling off a boat in the Yellow River while drunk. It was traditional in China that when an emperor died, the entire nation be closed off to foreigners. Thus, the incredibly painstaking attempts to establish good trade relations with China bore no fruit. Pires had spent 4 years in China for nothing. Future hopes of a trading post and potential conquest in China were gone. Okay, so now that we've caught up with Portugal, this is where things start to get pretty interesting. It's September 28th, 1522, and Holy Roman Emperor Charles just received a furious letter from newly appointed Portuguese King John III. It turns out, on the 6th of that same month, one of Magellan's ships, the Victoria, had arrived back in Seville carrying cloves from the Spice Islands. He had this to say, quote, "To present his complaint to the Emperor Charles V, because a ship of the fleet of Ferdinand Magellan, Magellan's Portuguese name, had arrived at Sanlúcar with a cargo of cloves taken in the Moluccas, then entered territory that belonged to Portugal, and to request the punishment of the ship's captains and the handing over of the cloves." John III thought that this ship had clearly passed through Portuguese Treaty of Tordesillas territory and had stolen cloves that were rightfully in Portugal's territory. The Tordesillas Treaty is really just causing way more problems than it's solving at this point. It wouldn't be until February of the next year that Charles would finally reply. To sum up what he said, woven in that usual formal glazing that kings would do, saying how great each other are, Charles essentially said, "Well, it was in my part of the Tordesillas Treaty, so I own it." He had no reason to believe this, he just kind of said it. We now know today that the Spice Islands were really in Portugal's section, but that was still unclear to them at the time. John III asked Charles to not send any more fleets to the Spice Islands, which Charles just didn't listen to, and he sent some anyways, possibly to pressure the Portuguese and also to slow their advances. In an attempt to ease tensions, the two nations met on a bridge over the Guadiana River, which separates the two countries. Each side brought their own cartographers, cosmographers, anybody science-related that would be able to prove to the other side that the Spice Islands were in their territory. It's kind of like an all-star game of medieval nerds. In total, they would meet 14 times, but they would never come to any reasonable conclusion. It was at this point that both sides kind of slowed down their talks, kind of realizing that it was pretty dumb, and ended up stopping the talks entirely on May 31st, 1525. 2 months later, Charles's Spanish fleet to the Spice Islands was ready to set sail. The only reasonable way to conclude who owned the islands was whoever held control. Charles's new fleet was much larger than the fleet he had supplied Magellan. They were massive, capable of carrying huge loads, and were armed to the teeth with artillery. It was clear what the intentions of the emperor were. The only way to know if Spain owned the source of the spice was to take it himself. With 7 ships and around 425 men, Charles's fleet set off for the Moluccas on the 17th of July, 1525. Some of the big differences between this and the Magellan voyage were, 1, there's no Portuguese on it at all. And 2, this one was a lot more intricate and planned out. Magellan had essentially already laid the groundwork for the voyage, and they were just going to follow what he did. Charles had learned from Magellan's voyage and sent out explicit instructions on what to do and when. There was to be no searching for straits. Charles planned for everything. He planned for the voyage to leave earlier so they wouldn't get hit with the awful weather that Magellan was hit with in Patagonia. As they headed south along Africa, they stopped in Sierra Leone and the Gulf of Guinea. They landed on an island where they reportedly found 2 skulls next to a tree with Portuguese words inscribed in it saying, "Here died the wretched Juan Ruiz, because he deserved it." That's pretty metal. It then appears that some of them might have eaten a pufferfish or something because they described catching a beautiful beaked fish and then all having terrible diarrhea. Who knows? From here, they would swing west and turn hard south when they approached the Portuguese-owned eastern coast of Brazil on December 5th. While Charles had accounted for missing the roughest seas of the year near Patagonia, the timing had resulted in the fleet arriving in the dead of winter. Luckily, they managed to soldier on, making it to the Cape of 11,000 Virgins in early January. This visit would prove disastrous for them. They became stuck there until late March, where 1 ship was lost to a wreck and 3 others deserted. The man who recounted the voyage said he saw salt marshes with large groups of sea lions and what he called flightless ducks, which were just penguins. That's adorable. On April 8th, they entered the Strait of Magellan, and on the morning of May 26th, they reached Cape Desiato, and finally made their way into the Pacific. They were immediately hit with a massive storm, and 3 of the 4 remaining ships disappeared in the chaos. Now the only ship left, the Santa Maria de la Victoria, was completely alone in a vast expanse of ocean. Something even more unfortunate, they were incredibly low on provisions, and a lot of their men started dying from scurvy. The bodies kept piling up, but meanwhile in July they ended up catching the northeast trade winds. They went through 3 captain generals at this time. They were tempted to stop in Chipungu in Japan on their way to the Moluccas, but as men died every day, they decided to beeline it to the Spice Islands. Here's something crazy. When they eventually found Guam, or the Island of Thieves, they were actually approached by a Spanish man named Gonzalo de Vigo, who was a castaway from the Magellan fleet who had been living there for 3 years. On the 10th of September, they left in search of the spice, taking Vigo with them. After 2 more captain generals died, they reached the largest southerly island in the Philippines on October 6th, and the natives there even mentioned the Portuguese, and didn't have great things to say about them. They left on October 15th on the seasonal monsoon winds. On the 29th of October, they saw Gilolo, the largest island of the Moluccas, and approached it on the 2nd of November. After 440 days of travel, on the 4th of November, they entered the port of Zemofo. They had departed Spain with 7 ships and 450 men, and arrived with 1 ship and 150 men, but they had done it. The Spanish were now in enemy territory once again. The Portuguese were nearby and already on high alert. It was time. Time to determine who owned not just these islands, but the incredible wealth potential they contained. No imaginary line would do this time. The only way to know was by possessing it. Two sister nations were about to fight halfway across the world. Everything was at stake, and both sides knew it. The search was over. Now the battle would begin.